All right. Welcome in everybody to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting one, I think, today. We're going to be tackling arrow performance. And, specifically for anyone out there considering or already hunting truly big game, really heavy boned animals, I'm thinking buffalo,
Yeah, for sure.
But we're not just going to be, throwing out opinions or, just kind of riffing from the hip. We're going to be diving into the detailed findings from a 2005 study update. And what makes this one really interesting, I think, is the amount of data they were working with.
Right.
We're talking about over 1,000 shots on buffalo.
Wow.
Yeah. Over 120,000 data points.
That's incredible.
So in this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is really pull out, the most important nuggets, I think, for you, the listener, from this massive data set.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to approach it. And just to add to that, just to kind of set the stage for everybody listening, it's important to remember that this 2005 study update, it wasn't done in isolation. It builds on this foundation of previous research that they had been doing.
Right.
And, each shot in this study and the ones before it just kind of adds to this body of knowledge of how arrows behave when they hit such powerful animals.
Right.
And the original researchers, they even noted that, while each test kind of answers some questions, it inevitably opens up new ones.
Oh, for sure.
So, while we're focused on what we knew as of 2005, this is a really cool look into, this ongoing effort to refine our understanding of, terminal ballistics.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, for you, the listener out there, I mean, trying to sift through sometimes conflicting recommendations or, what gear to use or whatever. I mean, what's great about this, deep dive is that you're getting insights that are based on a huge amount of real world data.
Exactly.
So let's jump into it. So, one of the places that the study starts is they establish these key minimums for arrow weight and impact force.
Okay.
And specifically, they're talking about normal to high FOC arrows. Now, FOC, just to clarify, it refers to where the weight of the arrow is balanced.
Oh.
So a higher FOC means more weight is towards the front. And that helps with a few things, stability in flight, it helps it get through the air better. But importantly, it helps with penetration.
Right.
So what are the minimums that the data suggests for taking on buffalo with this type of arrow setup?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And what's fascinating here is that the study actually provides specific minimums, and these are grounded in, a lot of practical testing. So when we're talking about arrow weight, the recommendation for buffalo hunting, with normal to high FOC arrows is at least 800 grains. Now, they make it clear that 900 grains or more is preferred, especially when you're targeting those, larger trophy bulls.
Yeah.
So think of this as moving from a standard weight arrow to something that is noticeably heavier in your hand.
Right.
That extra mass, it really makes a difference against those thick hides and heavy bones.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then regarding impact momentum, the study suggests a lower limit of 0.53 slug feet per second.
So 800 grains, at a minimum, ideally 900 or more, and at least 0.53 slug feet per second for momentum. Now, what's really important, as the study points out, is that these are minimum recommendations. It's not suggesting that there's some upper limit that you can't cross, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that's a really crucial distinction. The study really emphasizes that these are kind of the lower boundaries deemed necessary for, reliable penetration in most hunting scenarios, especially when you consider hitting bone, ribs and things like that.
Yeah.
And we know from the data that successful kills with lighter arrows, they do happen.
They do happen.
However, these guidelines, I think, are designed to give you a much higher probability of, achieving a complete pass-through on a well-placed double lung shot,
Right.
with, enough remaining energy to potentially exit on the far side.
Yeah, and having the energy to break that far rib, that opposite side rib.
Exactly.
It's about maximizing your chances for an ethical and effective kill consistently, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
That's a great way to put it. It's about ensuring, a high level of consistency and reliability, especially when you're dealing with an animal as large and tough as a buffalo.
Right. Absolutely. Now, the study also dedicates a lot of attention to the broadhead itself.
Okay.
And they really highlight the importance of what they term a benchmark broadhead.
Right.
So what exactly defines a benchmark broadhead in this context, and why is it so important?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it brings up a really vital point about the quality and the design of the broadhead. So the study defines a benchmark broadhead as one that is not only made with high-quality materials and excellent construction, but it also demonstrates the best terminal performance when compared to other broadheads in its class.
Okay.
So as of 2005, based on all their extensive testing, the study identified only 3 benchmark broadheads.
Oh, wow.
So for single blade designs with a high mechanical advantage, the 190 grain grizzly and the 170 grain modified grizzly, and this is essentially a 190 grain grizzly that had been narrowed to a 1-inch cutting diameter. Those were the benchmarks.
Okay.
And then the Ben Pearson deadhead was also recognized as a benchmark for wide cut broadheads with a moderate mechanical advantage.
Okay, so these aren't just any sharp broadheads. I mean, these represent like the top performers, right?
Absolutely.
In their respective categories. Okay. Now, the study also mentions that for heavy-boned game, and they're including, deer in this, they prefer a best quality fixed blade.
Right.
So how does that differ from a benchmark?
Yeah, this is a really important distinction, I think, to kind of grasp. So a best quality broadhead, as defined by the study, is one that is well manufactured, using good materials. It's got a solid, robust construction. It's definitely a step up from a, poorly made or flimsy broadhead.
Right.
But a benchmark broadhead goes beyond that by demonstrating superior terminal performance in the actual testing,
Right.
So what's fascinating here is that the study suggests that while a best quality fixed blade is generally recommended for heavy-boned game, including deer, using a benchmark broadhead provides this kind of additional level of penetration capability, particularly when you encounter dense bone.
Okay.
It's like having an extra layer of insurance on those less than perfect shots,
Right.
even when hunting small or big game. So benchmark broadheads, I mean, they're not just sharper, they're designed to fail less and penetrate deeper, especially through bone,
Right.
and that's a crucial advantage.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, having that extra margin for error can be huge. Now, the study also talks about the relationship between the broadhead ferrule, and that's the part that connects to the arrow shaft, and the arrow shaft diameter itself.
Okay.
So what were the key findings there?
Yeah, this is an interesting detail that, can impact penetration.
Sure.
So the study found that in a significant 97% of the shots that resulted in a complete pass-through of the buffalo's thorax, the diameter of the arrow shaft was at least 5% smaller than the diameter of the broadhead's ferrule.
Okay.
And, in most of these successful shots, the shaft diameter was actually 8 to 12% smaller.
Wow.
So the implication here is that a slightly smaller diameter shaft can kind of reduce friction as the arrow passes through the animal, allowing the broadhead to do its job more efficiently.
Right. It's almost like it's creating this, I don't know, like a slipstream for the fletching and the shaft to follow behind the broadhead.
Exactly, yeah. But also, it's really important to remember, and the study really emphasizes this, that perfect arrow flight is essential for achieving, good terminal performance.
Right.
So all the arrows used in this, extensive testing were, meticulously tuned to make sure that they flew straight and true.
Right. You got to have a good, tune on your bow and everything.
Absolutely.
So we know a high-quality, well-designed broadhead is really important, right?
Yep.
And that fit between the broadhead and the arrow shaft can play a role in penetration. Now let's talk about one of the major challenges, I think, when hunting buffalo. Those incredibly thick and overlapping ribs
Oh, yeah.
that protect their vital organs. So what did the study reveal about how well arrows penetrated these ribs? And then, maybe we can talk about how different broadhead types performed in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where the data really highlights the differences in broadhead performance under real-world hunting conditions. So they found that a very impressive 94% of normal and high FOC arrows that were tipped with a benchmark single-blade broadhead, they successfully traversed the thorax on shots that impacted only a rib.
Wow, that's a high percentage.
That's a very significant success rate. Now, when we look at, all the shots that passed completely through the thorax, regardless of broadhead type, 62.2% of them had a modified cut-on contact tanto tip.
Okay.
Now, in stark contrast, while multi-blade broadheads were used in 37% of the shots that hit a rib, they only accounted for a mere 6% of the shots that actually made it all the way through the thorax.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It's a big difference.
Yeah, and I mean, it really underscores, I think, how critical that broadhead design is.
Absolutely.
For effectively penetrating that tough rib cage.
Yeah.
Now, the study, they specifically highlight that cut-on contact tanto tip. So what makes that design so effective when it comes to penetrating bone?
Yeah, so the study suggests that the cut-on contact tanto tip significantly improves the structural integrity of the broadhead, particularly that very tip itself,
Yeah.
making it much more resistant to bending or breaking upon impact with bone.
Okay.
And then furthermore, this tip design demonstrated the lowest frequency of bone skips or skids compared to other tip designs that were tested.
Okay.
So that means a broadhead with a cut-on contact tanto tip is much more likely to bite into and penetrate bone rather than glancing off or being deflected.
Right. So you got that strong, robust tip that can withstand that force.
Yeah,
And then the design itself encourages that straight line penetration,
exactly.
to get through those thick ribs. Now, let's delve into a concept that I think can be a little bit counterintuitive for some people.
Okay.
And that's the importance of the impulsive force
Okay.
and the actual mass of the arrow,
Right.
as opposed to just focusing on achieving maximum arrow speed.
Speed.
Yeah. And the study actually touches on why heavier arrows, they often tend to outperform lighter, faster arrows,
Right.
especially when you're hunting these really big animals.
Yeah.
So can you break that down for us in a way that's kind of easy to understand?
Yeah, absolutely. So this gets into the fundamental physics of penetration. And while the initial impact force of an arrow is certainly a factor, the study really highlights that the arrow's mass and the duration over which that impact force is applied, what's scientifically known as the impulse time,
Okay.
are absolutely critical for achieving deep penetration on tough targets.
Okay.
So with lighter arrows that achieve high velocity, even if their initial impact force is similar to that of a heavier arrow, the impulse time is significantly shorter.
Okay.
So this shorter impulse time results in a much greater peak impulse force.
Okay.
So a very high spike of force delivered over a very brief period.
Yeah.
And a much more rapid deceleration of the arrow
Yeah.
once it encounters resistance, like bone or dense tissue.
Okay.
Think of it like the difference between tapping something quickly with a lot of force
Yeah.
versus pushing it with sustained, albeit, perhaps slightly lower force.
Right. That's a great way to put it. So the lighter, faster arrow, it delivers that quick, powerful hit.
Yeah.
But then it loses its energy very rapidly once it starts meeting resistance.
Yeah.
It's almost like
Yep.
it slams on the brakes, right?
Exactly. And this rapid deceleration puts a tremendous amount of stress on that entire arrow and broadhead system.
Right.
And this is where the concepts of high mechanical advantage broadheads becomes relevant again.
Okay.
The study explains that these types of broadheads not only increase the amount of work, quote unquote,
Yeah.
that the arrow can do with its available kinetic energy,
Okay.
but also cause the resistance to occur over a longer duration of time. It's like applying the brakes in a car more gradually and smoothly.
Yeah.
So this more gradual deceleration reduces the peak stress on the arrow and the broadhead,
Okay.
making them less likely to fail and ultimately allowing for deeper penetration.
Okay.
And heavier arrows, because of their greater mass, they tend to maintain their momentum for a longer period,
Okay.
resulting in a longer impulse time and a less abrupt deceleration.
Okay.
So the sustained push, I think, is really crucial for getting through those thick hides and heavy bones.
Right. It's not just about that initial hit. It's about maintaining that momentum
Right.
and managing that resistance,
Exactly.
effectively over a longer period of time.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, the study also provides some really interesting insights, I think, into arrow shaft materials and their durability,
Okay.
especially, considering the forces involved in hitting those heavy bones.
Right.
So what were the key findings there?
Yeah, so the study's findings regarding arrow shaft materials actually challenge some commonly held beliefs within the archery community. So among traditional wood shafts, laminated birch and purple heart perform quite well, exhibiting durability, comparable to hickory.
Okay.
But one particular wood, Ipe, really stood out
Okay.
as an exceptional performer in terms of strength and the ability to be made into small diameter, high grain weight arrows.
Right.
And those are ideal characteristics for buffalo hunting.
Right.
On the other hand, ash shafts, they showed a higher rate of breakage during testing
Oh, okay.
and were not recommended for this type of hunting.
Okay.
So across all shaft materials tested, the most common point of breakage was consistently either right behind the broadhead taper on wooden shafts or just behind the insert on synthetic shafts.
Okay.
And this type of breakage often occurred during angled impacts or when the arrow was deflected by ribs. Again, highlighting the importance of minimizing broadhead skip or deflection upon impact.
Right.
If you can prevent that from happening, it's going to really increase the durability of your arrow.
Right. So it's fascinating that, that point of failure was so consistent across different materials.
Yeah,
I mean, it really emphasizes, I think, that stress that's concentrated at that point
absolutely.
of impact. Now, what about the performance of synthetic arrow shafts?
Yeah, so synthetic shafts, particularly those made with carbon and used with brass inserts and steel adapters, they performed reasonably well overall. However, the study observed that in every instance where a synthetic shaft split or broke, it occurred in conjunction with some form of broadhead failure.
Okay.
So this observation led the researchers to recommend, considering double shaft construction for synthetic arrows when specifically targeting heavy game like buffalo, as it can significantly increase the overall strength and resistance to breakage.
Right.
However, they also cautioned that achieving perfect arrow spine, and that consistent, accurate flight with double shaft arrows can be a really technically challenging and time-consuming process.
Oh, for sure.
Reiterating that perfect arrow flight is absolutely non-negotiable for optimal terminal performance.
Right.
Interestingly, the study also explored this idea of using a small diameter, very dense wood shaft, like Ipe, inside a larger diameter synthetic shaft,
Okay.
to create this kind of hybrid arrow that offered both the durability of the wood and potentially, the straighter tolerances of the synthetic material.
Right. It's trying to, get the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
So while synthetic materials can offer some advantages, how they're constructed and how that broadhead is connected,
Yeah.
those are critical factors for durability. And it's really interesting that the study actually addresses this, I think, longstanding question about using wood shafts with modern compound bows.
Yeah, absolutely. So the study explicitly states that the tested hardwoods, with the notable exception of ash, they performed without any significant issues when shot from compound bows.
Right.
And this is, a really important point, I think, that directly contradicts some widely held assumptions within the bow hunting community.
Right.
So, when we look at the actual data on shaft damage rates that were observed during the extensive Asian buffalo testing, that was conducted as part of the study.
Okay.
The results are quite revealing. So carbon arrow shafts experienced a damage rate of 32.6%. Aluminum shafts had a damage rate of 16%, while hardwood shafts showed a significantly lower damage rate of only 7.6%.
Wow.
So this data, it strongly suggests that that the specific hardwood shafts tested in this study were considerably more durable than both carbon and aluminum shafts.
Wow. So that's a pretty surprising statistic, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, wood outperforming.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah, in terms of durability in these real-world hunting tests.
Exactly.
And the study also looked at the failures specifically with diggle shaft arrow setups.
Yeah, they did. They found that the failures that were observed in double shaft arrows primarily involved the aluminum or brass broadhead tapers or inserts that connected the broadhead to the outer shaft.
Okay.
And significantly, when one-piece steel broadhead adapters and inserts were used to connect the broadhead to the double shaft system, no shaft damage was recorded at all.
Wow, so it's all about that connection point and how strong and how well integrated it is.
Exactly.
Especially in those high-impact scenarios.
Right.
And maybe one of the most compelling findings here is how that specific type of broadhead used actually impacted the rates of shaft damage.
Absolutely. So when they looked at the arrow shafts that were used in conjunction with the benchmark, high mechanical advantage broadheads,
Okay.
specifically the 190-grain Grizzly and the modified 170-grain Grizzly, the rates of shaft damage just plummeted across all the tested materials.
Oh.
So for carbon shafts, the damage rate dropped dramatically to just 12%.
Okay.
For aluminum shafts, it fell to a mere 5%. And for hardwood shafts, the damage rate was less than 1%.
Wow, those are incredible numbers.
Yeah. So these figures not only highlight, the inherent durability of the specific hardwood shafts that were tested,
Right.
but they also really strongly suggest that there's a significant structural advantage gained by using a broadhead design with high mechanical advantage and a tip geometry that is less prone to skidding or, excessive force transfer upon impact and bone.
Yeah, it seems like that broadhead's ability to penetrate cleanly and efficiently really has a positive impact on reducing that stress and potential for damage on the arrow shaft.
Absolutely.
And, this kind of ties directly into that last point in this section of the study, the link between broadhead damage or failure to penetrate and damage to the arrow shaft.
Yeah, exactly. So they found that a vast majority of the instances where arrow shafts were damaged occurred in shots where the broadhead itself was also damaged, or the broadhead failed to achieve adequate penetration, especially on bone.
Right.
And both of these scenarios, broadhead failure and a failure to penetrate deeply, they share a common underlying factor: a sudden and very significant increase in resistance force during that penetration process.
Right.
So this abrupt spike in resistance, it puts enormous stress on the entire arrow system,
Right.
making a failure of either the shaft, the broadhead, or both, much more likely to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the takeaway here is, choosing a well-designed, strong broadhead that's capable of penetrating effectively.
Yeah.
I mean, not only does that increase your chances of an ethical kill,
Right.
but it's also really important for protecting that arrow setup.
Absolutely.
Now, the study also touches on shot placement, which, we've talked about before.
Yeah.
And they reference back to their 2004 update on that.
Right.
It wasn't the primary focus of this 2005 update,
Yeah.
but it's obviously really important.
Right. Oh, absolutely. The study rightly points out that even with the most, meticulously optimized arrow and broadhead setup, proper shot placement remains an absolutely fundamental prerequisite for achieving the levels of penetration that these recommendations are based upon.
Right.
The data and the conclusions drawn from the study are based on the assumption of a well-placed shot within the animal's vital zone.
Absolutely. All this technical information is great, but if you can't hit the broadside of a barn, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. You got to be able to put the arrow where it needs to go.
Absolutely. So let's synthesize this, right?
Okay.
Based on our deep dive here, what are the key takeaways? What are the things that our listeners should really keep in mind when it comes to optimizing their arrow performance for hunting heavy game like buffalo or even other big game species?
Yeah, so the study provides several really clear and actionable final takeaways. So firstly, for all big game animals that possess heavy bone structure, and this definitely includes deer-sized game, the selection of a, best quality fixed blade broadhead is strongly recommended.
Okay.
Due to its inherent strength and overall reliability.
Okay.
Now, while perhaps not strictly essential for smaller big game animals, opting for one of the benchmark broadheads identified in the study, can provide that significant, added layer of insurance.
Right.
Particularly in situations involving less than perfect shot placement or maybe unexpected encounters with heavy bone.
Okay.
For buffalo specifically, the study's minimum recommended arrow weight is 800 grains, with a preference for 900 grains or more when pursuing those larger trophy bulls.
Right.
The absolute minimum impact momentum your arrow should generate is 0.53 slug feet per second.
Okay.
And it's important to reiterate that that is a lower limit, with no inherent upper restriction. The study also strongly suggests the use of a cut-on contact tanto tip design on any fixed blade broadhead, as this tip geometry has been shown to improve the broadhead's structural integrity upon impact and significantly reduce the likelihood of the broadhead skipping or deflecting off bone.
Right.
And finally, the data from the study indicates that certain types of hardwood arrow shafts can offer greater durability than the specific synthetic shafts that were tested.
Okay.
However, a properly constructed double-shafted synthetic arrow, when used in conjunction with a one-piece steel broadhead adapter or insert,
Right.
can achieve, comparable or even greater levels of durability.
Right.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to keep in mind that all of these findings reflect the data and the state of knowledge as of 2005.
Right.
And future advancements in archery technology and, further research may well lead to updated recommendations in the years to come.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It's important to remember that this is a snapshot in time, and as technology improves, as materials improve, as we learn more, these recommendations might change.
Exactly.
But I mean, what's great is that we've got these really, really strong recommendations that are based on, a huge amount of real world data.
Absolutely. It allows us to move beyond, personal opinions and conjecture and into a realm of understanding that is grounded in, rigorous analysis of a large body of empirical evidence.
And I'm going to said it better myself.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of our deep dive here.
Okay.
Into arrow performance for heavy game. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider.
Okay.
So given the data we've discussed today regarding the critical role of impulsive force and the impact of arrow mass on achieving reliable penetration,
Right.
what potential limitations might there be in focusing solely on achieving that maximum arrow speed? in modern bow hunting setups. Especially when we're targeting these large and potentially dangerous game animals.
Mm.
So really think about that balance,
Yeah.
between arrow velocity, overall arrow mass, and then the specific design characteristics of your chosen broadhead,
Right.
and how all those factors work together to contribute to optimal terminal performance and ethical outcomes, in those real-world hunting situations.
It's definitely a complex equation.
Yeah.
And I sincerely hope that, this deep dive into the 2005 study has provided you with some valuable insights to consider, as you make your own equipment choices.
Absolutely. And I want to add to that, we encourage you, the listener, to delve even further into the original study, explore other research and resources that are out there.
Yeah.
Really take some time to consider how these principles and findings might apply to your own specific hunting situations, the types of game you pursue, the equipment that you choose to use.
Absolutely.
There's always more to learn,
There is.
and a deeper understanding can ultimately make you a more informed, more effective, and ultimately a more ethical hunter.
And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the deep dive, and we will see you next time.
See you later.